They told me that level Z didn't exist. Not in official records, not in the labyrinthine diagrams of the Apostolic Library, not in the endless catalogues of manuscripts that had survived fire, flood, and schism. The archivists laughed when I asked about it, a thin kind of laughter that did not reach their eyes, as though I had uttered something obscene in a holy place. And yet, when the sealed envelope slid across my desk, stamped with a wax seal I had only seen once before, the letter inside named it plainly, Inspect Level Z asterisk. I should have shredded it, should have pretended it never came, but I didn't. I signed, I packed my notes, and I walked straight into the shadows they had spent centuries cultivating. The Vatican is a place of walls within walls, corridors that seem to fold in on themselves like origami. You think you know where you are until you don't. The deeper you walk, the more you realize the city above is only a skin stretched tight over caverns of history, of secrets. I followed the escort through doors that groaned like coffins being opened, past staircases that descended into black air. My badge, newly minted, the ink on its holographic cross still sharp, opened scanners without a blink. No one stopped me, but no one looked at me either. That was worse. In the Vatican, invisibility is never accidental. The stairwell to level Z was narrower than it should have been, as though designed to keep shoulders brushing the walls, to remind you that escape was never going to be simple. The air smelled of mold and something older, a sourness like incense long extinguished. My hand trailed along the wall, tracing grooves worn smooth by centuries of other hands. I kept telling myself this was a formality, a meaningless inspection of a floor that didn't officially exist, but each step downward scraped that lie thinner. There was weight below, not metaphorical, not imagined, but physical weight pressing up through the stones, as though the archives themselves resented being disturbed. At the first landing, I saw the plaster had cracked into shapes that resembled letters, but no language I recognized. I brushed them with my fingertips, and the dust clung like ash. The escort pretended not to notice. His collar was stiff, too stiff, as though it had never belonged to cloth. He didn't speak except to murmur prayers under his breath, words I caught only in fragments. Libera nos a malo vincula tenebrarum, deliver us from evil, chains of darkness. When we reached the gate, he simply stopped, handed me a keyring that looked centuries old, and turned back the way we came. I wasn't dismissed. I was abandoned. The gate bore no sign, no inscription, only iron bars thick enough to cage beasts. The first key I tried slid in too easily. The lock clicked, echoing like a gunshot in the silence. The gate opened on its own, pulled inward by a draft that carried the unmistakable smell of parchment, brittle, ancient, dust-stained parchment. But there was something beneath it, a copper tang that I recognized far too quickly as blood. I should have stopped then. I should have turned and walked away, told them level Z was nothing but brick and mold. But the thought of their knowing smirks burned in me. I had to see it. The corridor beyond the gate was lined with alcoves, niches that once might have held saints, statues, but now stood empty, their outlines smeared with soot. My footsteps didn't echo. That was what unsettled me most. It was as though the air was swallowing sound before it could return, silencing not just the corridor but me within it. I whispered my own name, a test, and the syllables vanished into the dark like a stone dropped into bottomless water. The first chamber I found was a reading room, but not like the marble halls above. This one was crude, carved from raw stone. Tables sagged beneath the weight of tomes bound in cracked hides, the pages swollen with moisture, blackened at the corners. A single lamp swung above, though no flame burned in it. Instead, the wick smoldered with something cold, pale, unnatural, a light that revealed without illuminating. I walked among the tables, my hand trembling as I opened one book, then another. None of them were indexed. None of them should have existed. One bore a title scratched into its cover with what looked like fingernails. Liber Umbri Asterisk, the Book of Shadow. Inside, the script crawled like ants across the page, Latin interspersed with something far older. I recognized fragments of the Vulgate altered, inverted. In principio erat verbum. In the beginning was the word, followed by scrawls that twisted it into blasphemous inversions, claiming that before the word was the whisper, before light was the shadow that gave it form. My throat tightened as I read, as though something unseen wanted to crawl inside and nest there. I closed the book too quickly, and the dust that rose carried the scent of sulfur. The silence pressed harder the deeper I went. I realized then that silence could have weight, could crush thought, could make your own heartbeat sound like blasphemy. In a corner I saw a lectern chained to the floor. Upon it lay a manuscript wrapped in oilcloth. The cloth was damp, stained through. I hesitated, but my hand moved without permission, peeling it back. The cover was not leather. It was smooth, faintly translucent. Skin, but not human. I froze as recognition dawned. And yet, against every rational instinct, I opened it. The first page bled when I touched it. Not metaphorically, not imagination, but red welled up from the letters themselves, tracing the grooves as though the ink had always been liquid and always would be. My fingertips came away wet. I searched my hands for cuts, found none. My lips began to whisper syllables I had not chosen, fragments of prayer in reverse, syllables that twisted in my throat. I snapped the book shut, heart pounding. The blood dried instantly, as though mocking me, leaving only clean parchment where moments ago there had been horror. I wanted to run. I wanted to throw the key away, to flee up the stairwell and beg never to be sent here again. But some part of me, the part that signed the letter instead of burning it, the part that traced cracked plaster for words, insisted I had only begun. I thought then of the escort, of his refusal to follow me inside. I understood why. Level Z was not for the eyes of men. It was for the things the Vatican had sworn to bury but never could destroy. As I turned to leave, the lamp above me swayed, not from any draught, but as though something had brushed it. The shadows bent, thickened, converged. I heard it then, faint, deliberate, the sound of breathing. It wasn't mine. It came from between the shelves, deep and steady, like someone trying not to be heard. My throat dried, but I forced my feet to move. I didn't run. Running would have admitted that it had already noticed me. When I closed the gate behind me, the lock resisted, reluctant, as though it wanted me to return. I left the keyring on the floor and walked away without looking back. But as I climbed the stairwell, the smell of incense followed me, not old, not extinguished, but freshly lit. With every step upward, the sense of weight pressed harder on my chest, as though the archives themselves had branded me for daring to see them. They told me Level Z didn't exist. They lied. I saw it. I touched it. And now, even in daylight, with the sun blazing through stained glass, I can feel the cold smolder of that impossible lamp burning behind my eyes. I should never have gone down there. I should never have opened that first page. Because once Level Z knows you, it never forgets. I tell myself I close the gate, but some nights I wake to the sound of keys turning in the dark, and I can't shake the dread that Level Z has already followed me home. I do not sleep after the first descent, yet at dawn I sign the inspection ledger with a hand that pretends nothing has changed. The office smells of toner and old coffee. A crucifix tilts above the door as if trying not to watch me. I ask the clerk whether the unnumbered reading room requires humidity checks. He looks at my badge and chooses not to hear the question. I should have stopped when silence became the official answer, but I keep the key in my pocket and walk the corridor no one maps, counting my steps the way a penitent counts beads. In the stairwell, the air tastes mineral, a breath drawn through stone. The lamp down there burns again without flame, patient, cold, confident, and the smell that travels with it is not incense, not beeswax, but a copper sweetness that reminds the mouth of accidents. I tell myself I am only returning to confirm a note, to verify a shelf mark that will not exist, to prove to myself that the first page was an illusion. I lie expertly and go down. I unwrap the manuscript and the cover refuses every name I have for skin. It is not leather. It is too seamless. It is not vellum. It is too warm. When I tip it toward the light, branching lines wake beneath the surface and drift like veins arranging themselves for surgery. The surface resists my glove as though it remembers a different hand. I whisper that I am here only to catalogue, trivial as inventory, and the lamp flickers in disagreement. I should have stopped when my breath fogged in air that was not cold, But I do the thing I have done in other safe rooms 100 times. I set weights, I square the spine, I run a gloved knuckle down the gutter to ease the binding. The book flexes, like something sighing into a posture it had hoped to avoid. The first page accepts my touch the way a mouth accepts water. The fibers gleam, and the ink sits glossy as if newly laid. The red rubric is not pigment. It beads on my glove, pulls together, and runs downhill into the line until the sentence looks freshly wounded. I check my fingers for a cut and find none, only the memory of warmth where the page touched me. The text arranges itself in double columns, disciplined and priestly, but the margins lean inward as if eavesdropping. Latin pretends to be the house language. Familiar cadences lull the eye. In Capite library, at the head of the book, Vidi supra, see above. Amen, so be it. Then a letter tilts, an accent migrates, and the known road bends into unfamiliar country. I should have stopped when grammar became topography. I read aloud as one tests a tooth, small phrases placed carefully between breath and doubt. In principio erat verbum holds for a heartbeat, then detours into a sibilant chain that tastes like iron on the tongue. A diagram interrupts the paragraph. Interlocking circles, intersecting lines, a choir stall viewed from above. At each crossing a tiny name has been scratched and abraded, then written again as if the parchment kept rejecting the spelling. I thought I was imagining movement until a circle drifted to accept a line I had not yet seen, adjusting the geometry as a choir adjusts pitch. The title inscribed above the lattice is not Latin. At a glance it looks like Greek stripped of its vowels. On a second look, it resembles Hebrew that does not believe in horizontals. On a third it is only itself, a word older than paper pretending to be map. The gloss in the margin belongs to a terrified scribe who cannot keep himself from confessing. His tiny hand supplies Latin labels like apologies, nomina veterum, names of the old ones, clavis sigillorum, key of the seals, oratio subversiva, the prayer that unfastens. A diagram assigns gates to the body, eyes as janui lucis, ears as scaly, tongue as ostium confessionis, skin as pallium. Under the breastbone he draws a small circle and writes a word I do not recognize, letters that look like nails set in mortar. The gloss ends with 4 directions in a different ink, as if someone less patient than the scribe has cut in. Do not shape the syllables. Do not add heat. Do not feed the page. Do not be the mouth. I should have closed the book when warnings learn to speak in imperatives, but the imperative I obey is always the one that promises a catalogue entry. Halfway through the folios, the stock thickens, as if the maker armored the center against escape. Threads disappear into the spine and reappear a few lines later like sutures in a wound still learning how to close. Dates march without centuries. Dies Luni, dies Martis, then unfamiliar days, dies Nigri, the black day, dies Mutus, the mute day, dies Reditus, the day of return. Each carries a notation measured like a prescription, a mouth, a drop, a whisper, an oath. The instruction beneath the calendar is copied twice, once neat and once with the panic of a second hand. Sanguis minimum, cala minimum, nomen integrum. The blood minimal, the heat minimal, the name entire. The neat hand adds, use thorn, not knife. The second adds, use anyone's hand but your own. The scalpel on the table gleams like a suggestion I pretend not to hear. I pick it up to move it away, and the glove parts, silent and obedient. The bead that swells on my fingertip looks theatrical until it lands on the margin exactly where the scribe indicated. Heat travels through the page like breath under cloth. Letters loosen. Vowels turn their faces toward me. Lines I struggled to align a minute ago now lean forward, eager as novices at a grill. I should have stopped when the floor felt softer, as if water were rising through stone, but I follow the column because the column follows me, simplifying itself to meet the limits of my mouth. The name is braided from 3 strands, each requiring a different mouth. The first catches in the back of the throat and tastes like ash. The second spreads behind the teeth like stone dust. The third climbs the palate and leaves a chill like water in a crypt. I say them carefully, not loudly, but correctly. Sound is not always volume. The lamp steadies. The margins press closer. I think of the cardinal who signed my clearance, and then swore he had never seen me, of the escort who abandoned me at the gate, of the ledger full of signatures that look like nobody's handwriting. These are the thoughts I feed to fear, so fear will sit and wait. I should have stopped when I realized I had saved a breath just for the ending. Nothing explodes. The room does not buckle. The only change is the absence of one. I cannot hear my own breath. For a moment I think I have stopped breathing, but my chest rises, obedient, as if breathing has been outsourced. The page brightens not with light, but with attention, columns sharpening like a lens finding focus. A footnote I had read as smudging becomes legible. Quod vocatur venit, quod venit manit. That which is called comes. That which comes stays. The hair along my forearms lies flat as though pressed by a passing hand. I do not turn. I do not look under the table. I recite the safest sentence I know, a museum mantra about provenance and condition, and the words come out like inventory tagged to a corpse. Beneath the table something wet reaches maturity. I do not see it so much as hear the idea of it. The sound paper makes when soaked and lifted, the slow peel of adhesion surrendering. A dark patch blooms around the table's feet and refuses to reflect the lamp. I step back, and the stain follows, not physically, but in the way a thought insists. The columns arrive at a final line that wasn't there when I began and asks me a question in a grammar I understand too well. Will you be its mouth, or will it use another? I should have stopped when the question used you instead of one, but I am already answering by not answering, already consenting by continuing to read. I close the manuscript because haste feels like invocation, and wrap it again though the oilcloth reekles like skin from cold. I dim the lamp. Darkness does not return yet. I lock the gate. Lock hesitates, then swallows the click. On the stair I taste beeswax and burnt hair, and realize the ringing is not bells but my name backwards. If the page learned the shape of my blood, then the next time it speaks the name, I won't be the reader. I'll be the vowel it uses. I tell myself I will not say it again, that the syllables were an accident of breath in a room that trains breath to become prayer, but the name has edges, and I keep cutting my tongue on it. Every archive log I pull for level Z carries the same black bar, the same amputated space in a field of meticulous detail. Condition, provenance, shelf mark, scribe, illumination, and then the redaction like a bandage over a severed word. Even the microfilm from the 70s bears the bar, as if the censor is congenital, passed down through machines rather than men. I hold the reels to the light, like a lay pilgrim squinting at a relic, and the bar is still there, occluding what my curiosity has already begun to supply. I begin measuring it, height, width, placement, like a forensic cataloger of silence, as if the shape of what is missing might confess its substance. The cataloger in me tries to reverse engineer what an institution tries to forget. I compare the distance between fields in uncensored entries. I match habits of the clerks. I listen for the rhythm of the old stamps. Shame blooms because even in my refusal to say the forbidden, I am honoring its form. I am tracing an absence and calling it necessary. I am templating the amputation and feeling clever for believing shape can stand in for meaning. I should have stopped then. Stopped. On a high shelf, I find a codex whose foredge bears a word carved into the parchment itself. I whisper it again, barely louder, and the sound does not leave my mouth so much as step out of it. The room rearranges itself around that step. For a breath there is nothing. No footfall, no paper sigh, no small noises that prove the world continues without me. And then the breathing resumes between the shelves, truer to itself this time, uninterested in imitating human cadence. A metallic taste climbs my tongue. The hair at my nape recruits into a memory of fingers. I tell myself names only have the power we loan them, but the thought is counterfeit. Power here is not borrowed but recognized, a credential older than seals and signatures. I could stop. I do not. In the corridor, I test the name at conversational volume, the way one tests a lock with a key one is not sure they should possess. The syllables slip under the door of an unmarked cell and return altered, as if someone repeated them with a split tongue. Footsteps do not approach, but a condition of having been approached settles over me, as if space itself has stood up from a chair and not said why. I think of the cardinal who swore he never signed my clearance, and wonder whether forgetting is a sacrament here, whether memory must be shriven of certain syllables to continue functioning in holy precincts. I should have turned back and confessed curiosity as sin, but confession has always been my trick for obtaining permission to continue. When the name rises again on the page, not the ornamental version on the foredge, but its internal anatomy, the skin peeled back, my mouth warms. The gloss identifies pieces of it with the matter-of-factness of a butcher. Aspirate, dental, liquid, stop, fricative, a string of mechanics that ought to make the word safer by breaking it into parts. Instead, the list reads like a corridor of small doors. I know better than to push any of them, which is why I push the smallest first, to prove that restraint remains possible. The smallest opens inward, as all dangerous doors do. Somewhere behind me, the lamp makes a sound like a wick consenting to be flame without changing color. I move my lips without voice, and the room hears me anyway. I think I am alone until the desk across from me creaks with the weight of something that does not require furniture. I do not look up, looking grants shape, and shape grants right. The lamp inclines by a fraction, the wick lengthens. A thread of smoke draws a line to the manuscript like a patient finger. On the top margin words appear in the color of old scabs, writing themselves in a hand I know with shame as my own. This is not summoning, the margin insists. This is attendance. Another line answers beneath it in smaller script, tight and terrified. If you keep reading, something will remember you. I put my palm over the new ink and feel heat that does not belong to my skin. I should have closed the book then and let the heat go cold, but I am a coward in only predictable ways. I close my eyes to reclaim the world behind the lids. There, too, the name insists. It crawls across the dark like a phosphor worm, leaving a trail that loops itself into an instruction I cannot unread. I break the loops only by opening my eyes again. I attempt prayer, but the Latin I feels like the husk of a meal already eaten. I attempt silence, but silence here functions as agreement. So I speak to the room as to a frightened animal, slowly, hands visible, no sudden movements. I say my own name aloud to anchor myself, first and middle and surname. They sound provisional, like placeholder text in a liturgy waiting for the true celebrant to arrive. The breathing between the shelves keeps time as if officiating. I imagine going upstairs, demanding silica gel, freezer space, white gloves, 2 witnesses. I imagine the clerk's face performing incomprehension as a method. Instead, I do the smaller, stupider thing available to a person addicted to documentation. I print the forbidden name in my notebook in square capitals, believing containment is a function of typography. The letters hold until I lift my pen. Then they lean together like conspirators and share a secret I cannot hear. When I tear the page free to destroy it, the fibers hesitate, unwilling to part, as if the name has gathered itself across the grain and redistributed its weight. I burn the scrap in the ashtray kept for nothing so worldly and still watch the smoke trace characters in the air that refuse to disperse until I breathe them. I tell myself I can hold it back. I clap the notebook shut. I wrap the manuscript. I brace the chair against the table and the feet squeal on stone. Mid-squeal, the sound changes key and becomes the last consonant of the name pronounced by a mouth that is not mine. I freeze and wait for the room to choose me. The lamp lifts a little, either in boredom or consent. The breathing withdraws, not down the corridor, not away, but into the air directly behind my left shoulder, where vision cannot claim jurisdiction. I should have run. Running would have made a noise the room could call permission. On the stair I rehearse refusal, surrender the keys, sign the ledger, book the train, vanish into the ordinary anonymity of people who never knew better. But the name rides in my mouth like a coin I cannot spit out in front of witnesses. It salts every swallow. It makes water taste like a promise and wine like a treaty. In the upper corridor, I pass a fresco whose eyes always follow the faithful. Today they follow the word inside me instead and look relieved to see it ambulatory, as though stone has been spared the burden of speaking. A guard crosses my path and smiles, as if we share a joke. His rosary knots knock together in a rhythm I almost recognize. I keep walking before recognition finishes the task. When night comes, the apartment chooses its noises. I set the notebook page on the table and invert a glass over it like a specimen. Glass fogs from the inside, though the room is dry. Letters swell, relax, swell again, practicing. I recite the rule the margin gave me. Do not be the mouth, and I should obey. Instead, I stand at the window and practice not saying what I am already forming. Rome hums at a pitch the manuscript seems to favor. Somewhere a siren drags a ribbon of sound through streets that were taught to echo saints and now echo something else. The glass ticks as if cooling after heat I did not supply. I discover I am counting breaths, but they refuse to align with my chest. The glass over the page does flicker. My reflection does not. It watches me with an attention that looks like pity, and when the final consonant leaves my throat on its own, the breath between the shelves answers from the street below, as if Rome has learned to breathe with my lungs. If I swallow the name tonight, I fear it will waken me tomorrow with a new mouth and decide it no longer needs mine. The confessional packets are not in the catalogue. They live where paper pretends not to be paper, bundled in red twine and stamped with seals that bite through dust. I find them in a wooden coffer whose hinges exhale when opened, as if the box has been absolved too often to believe in secrecy. Each envelope bears a date without a year and a crest impressed so deep the wax shines at its wounds. The clerk upstairs called them miscellany, a word people use when a thing is both known and forbidden, and swore they migrate on their own. I should have stopped when his eyes slid off the question like oil off holy water, but the key weighed against my palm like consent, and I went back down to level Z to read what should have stayed sealed. The handwriting runs like a man late for his own absolution. Latin slants into margins and stumbles back. Here and there fear outruns education, and Italian spills in. The first voice says he was summoned after Compline to a stair that did not exist in daylight. Candles in that corridor bent away from him, as if obeying a wind that spared everything else. He describes a procession without chant, no thurible, only rope, and at its end a room bricked in recent years, lime that remembers hands. The bier carried something wrapped, not shrouded. The cloth rose and fell though no breath should have been left, and the weight changed in their grip when they spoke the name I am not supposed to know. I should have stopped when my mouth tried to shape the syllables with no air behind them, but I kept reading. I count fingerprints in the margins, a cataloger's tick to keep belief from galloping. The prints overlap in a hurry's geometry, wax flakes fall like dried blood. Another letter. The writer signs himself only Custo's keeper and describes a vigil with a body that would not cool. They sang no litany. Voices failed. Every Gloria collapsed into throat clearing. The organ settled on a single note that sounded like a lung made of metal. The saint whispered, he writes, but not in language. It moved in the body like thought, and each time the not language passed over his teeth, his fillings rang. He tried to press the lids shut, but his thumbs would not agree. The eyes under his fingers felt like marbles kept in water, and when he let go they opened by right, not by effort. The pages stink of smoke and old soap. A blister shows where sealing wax fell while a priest's hands shook. A confessor complains that time would not sit still. The watch on his wrist added minutes while he spoke and subtracted them while he listened, so every sin required 2 absolutions to land in the present. He records a man who confessed the sin of dying wrong, mistimed his surrender, and returned in the middle of the credo after burial was attempted. Another ink, another century. Instructions for tying a rope around a jaw so a mouth cannot join in responses it has no right to offer. He writes that such measures slow, but do not cure. The mouth hums through linen like bees under a porch, rehearsing syllables with a patience that outlives attendance. Deeper in the bundle, scripts change, paper thins, a new seal appears bearing a fisher's ring engraved with an unfamiliar profile, the nose too long, the eye cut to look left forever. The letter beneath is all vowels for 3 lines, a howl in pen, and then words return like shore after a wave. We bargained, the writer confesses. We offered the bones of an older altar if the doors would stay shut. He does not name the doors. He lists the bones. Femurs from under a basilica floor, ribs from a reliquary whose label had lost its consonants, a skull that had been kissed smooth. The ink spiders where he admits the bargain was accepted, not by the church, but by the floor, which ceased to complain under a certain weight when they carried the beer across it. Between letters, someone has tucked a small card, a tracing of heartbeats during a watch. The stylus marks jump when nothing else moves, then flatten when the room begins to whisper. Someone has written underneath, foolish and brave, this is not demonic. The word demonic is amended twice, first to pre-angelic, then to pre-ecclesial, as if taxonomy could make what happened kinder. A later hand writes, call it covenantal, and I realize namming is the only magic we still permit, because it keeps our hands clean. I should have stopped when my finger traced the rise that coincides with a syllable I will not write, but the curve felt like a road, and I kept walking it. My mouth forms the forbidden syllables without voice to test whether the room outside the coffer will grow heavier. It does. The air thickens in the old way, patient as a notary. The next confession is not addressed to God. It begins to the other witness, the O leaning like a face at a grill. The priest admits he cut a piece of his tongue to draw a glyph in blood on a slab that resisted chalk. The slab drank the letter, not the blood. A list follows headed concessions, the ink browned to a domestic color. They conceded incense on the mute day, bread without blessing on the black day, an hour's extinguishing of every lamp in a corridor whose lamps were said to prevent famine, the permanent reassigning of a saint's name to a hallway so the hallway would remember to behave in emergencies. We conceded a voice. One line reads, the ink there is fresher than the rest. A later hand adds, smaller, not mine. Another overlays it, perhaps the same later night. Mine, then. My tongue retreats from the teeth like a child hiding behind a door. I set the letters back, and the coffer answers by shifting its weight, as if something within has stood up. I do not run. I inventory the sensation. Wax on unopened envelopes looks glossy now, as if warmed by breath from inside. I lay my palm on one, and the crest rises beneath the skin of the wax with a slow muscularity like a fish surfacing under ice. I sign a provisional log because signing disciplines the hands, and I have begun to suspect the hands more than the mouth. Ink dries in a hurry, eager to join a record that believes records can dam a tide. I pocket a fragment of wax by accident, a flake caught under the nail, and it proves warmer than my skin. On the way to the stair, I pass a fresco and watch its gold leaf dull where my shadow touches it. Upstairs, the clerk asks if I found what I needed. Humidity is acceptable, I say. He nods with gratitude too smooth, like a door oiled only on the side seen by visitors. Night. In the apartment, I untie the red twine I told myself I had retied. It lies obedient in my pocket like a living vein. I should have stopped when it pulsed, but I lay it across the table as one might lay out evidence for a jury. I tell myself to pray. I tell myself not to read the last page tucked into the packet, left unsealed by a hand that believed secrecy no longer useful. I read it. The last page begs forgiveness with a grammar that refuses God. The writer addresses the first hearer and repeats, we made a bargain, and then we forgot whom we had paid. He asks not to be exorcised, but to be released from a ledger. Let the debt fall where the promise rose, he pleads. We cannot bury what does not consider itself a body. When I lift the sheet to the lamp, a smear at the bottom edge darkens, new as a bruise, and the twine draws a slow breath across the table as if measuring circumference for a throat. I leave the glass over the page, but a breath fogs the inside from a mouth that isn't in the room. The corridor is never the same twice. I say that now as if it is a fact easily recorded, as if corridors were honest things whose changes can be filed under condition. In truth, the stone rearranges itself like a living thing clearing its throat. One moment the passage is a simple wedge of shadow between stacks. The next the mortar has sweated a dark glisten, and the arch leans as though bowing to someone who just passed. I learn to move with it in the small hours, when the lamps in the upper library have long since died, and whatever rules still bind the day have loosened their fingers. The frescoes are worst. They were painted to instruct and to sanctify. Now they watch as if they are waiting for retribution, and unable to act, have taken to blinking. It is a ridiculous verb, blink, until you stand under a saint whose eyelids close and open like a failing mechanism, and then the word fits like a glove. He blinks at me in judgment, at me in pity, at me as if wondering whether I might be useful. I should have stopped when the first saint's eye followed my hand, but I thought superstition could be catalogued the same way as mildew, so I walk past with a clipboard and pretend the tremor in my palm is merely fatigue. When the walls begin to breathe, it is not an arrival but a rhythm I should have recognized earlier in the stack rooms, in the way dust fell slower, as though measured against a metronome. At first, it is the smallest of things. A syllable formed inside my teeth when I reach for a folio. A Latin cadence I have not rehearsed since seminary that blooms across my tongue and makes hair rise along my forearms. Respice audi tes. The wall seems to say, look, listen, be silent. Yet the imperative comes out of me like an apology. I test this, silly, fatal, by touching the plaster where a Latin phrase has been incised in some other lifetime, and the stone gives, a little, as if acknowledging a hand that knows the right pressure. The fresco above me smiles thinly. The saint's painted lips move with a sound none in the corridor can hear, but I can feel in my molars a vibration as precise as a tuning fork. I hum it back without meaning to, and the corridor answers. A low, resonant inhalation that rearranges dust, motes into lines like a hand, writing across air. There are words I do not know I remembered until they are in my mouth. They arrive as memory before they ever belong to me. Vocabulary borrowed from a room that trusts me enough to lend speech. Latin mutates here. Verba in paratibus. Words in the walls become nouns for actions. Adspirea is not simply to breathe, but to bless without pardon. Obumbratio does not merely mean shade, but the ceremony of taking shade from you. I recite them to see if I still own my voice. The sound travels along the corridor and picks up punctuation from fresco eyes. A flicker, a slow lowering of a painted brow, the way a saint tilts head when asked a question he prefers not to answer. I should have stopped when the syllables organized themselves into an address and began to sketch the contour of my name into the margins of my skull. But the cataloger in me believes that namming is containment, that to list is to limit, and so I keep reading aloud, even though the walls now keep time with my breathing, and the time is not mine to give. Once, when I press my ear to the wall like a child learning how a house works, a scripture exhales into my skull. It does not read itself to me in the tender voice of a tutor. It speaks as though translating stone into blood. The phrase is not wholly Latin. It begins with pater noster, and then a syllable splits off and unravels into that older word I have tried to ignore. The syllables move through my bones like water through dry plaster. They leave residue, a thin salt taste at the back of my throat, the mineral signature of having listened where one should not. I stagger back, and the fresco above me blinks again, slower now, as if in approval or fatigue. I feel, with the sort of shame that belongs to long and irreversible bargains, that I have been sworn in without consent. When the wall exhales scripture, the words sound less like petition and more like accounting. Debts listed, lines itemized, a ledger of breathing. The corridor keeps its own time, and my watch ceases to be a reliable witness. Hours collapse. I become adept at counting in segments. 100 paces to the third arch, 3 prayers or 3 curse-like syllables to the next niche, a pause long enough for a fresco to rearrange its pupils. Sometimes the paint lifts slightly from the plaster and flakes like scab. Sometimes the stone sweats, tiny beaded rivers that cross the path your shoes make and leave tracks like prints. I have catalogued these phenomena in a notebook with the methodical cruelty of bureaucracy: date, time, temperature, humidity, my own subjective fear. And each entry feels like filing a hand to demonstrate that you still own your limbs. The tyranny of this habit is that the more I record, the more the walls supply. I learn to anticipate what they will ask. The walls prefer the passive voice and small admissions. They like me culpa murmured with a sincerity they can measure against a pulse. They do not respond well to anger. Anger makes them close and harden their frescoes into stony smiles. They do respond to contrition and to enumerations of sins that are specific. confessions that cannot be diluted into generalities. So I practice my failures like a litany, the petty betrayals, the small compromises, the ways I traded curiosity for validation. Each admission slides into the crevices between stones, and the walls hum like totalizers, tallying the weight of what I have allowed myself to be. I catch myself checking whether I have been forgiven, as if these breathing walls are the church's new confessional and I am their first client. I should have stopped when the walls began to reconcile my ledger without my asking, but that was demand for mercy, and I am greedy for absolution, even from the wrong mouth. There are nights the corridor refuses to be merely architectural. The frescoes lean forward like congregation and murmur among themselves in a script that makes the mortar vibrate. One saint drops his painted eyelid, and from that small aperture a word leaks, soft and oily, as if syllables can have texture. Mensa, crux, sigillum. Sometimes the phrase arrives as a question, quis est, who is present? And I cannot help the answer that slips out, my name, because names are all I have left that feel private. The answer goes into the stone and comes back modified, like a coin washed in salt. Once it returns, the corridor rearranges its arches for me, as if making a path I had not intended but now must walk. I am learning routes the walls want me to travel. When I press my ear to the plaster and the room breathes scripture into me, I also hear other things. The faint click of a hinge someone else has moved, the soft scrape of a robe passing an invisible threshold, a whisper like parchment sliding across a table. These sounds belong to the archives nocturne, and they are not all human. I am careful now with the verbs I use for them. I used to write wind and settling and think myself safe. The truth is simpler and colder. The walls are sentient in the narrow way that keepsers of ledgers become sentient, by being read and read and read until they remember what they once contained. They remember bargains, and they remember the tongues that traded them. When a wall breathes in Latin and exhales my name, it is not mercy it offers, it is accounting. I try to curse them out once, to spit a word that will make them stop. The curse is childish, not the sort that rearranges letters like sacrament, and the corridor answers with a rustling that sounds like the turning of many pages, pages that spell what I was about to say before I say it. The fresco above me blinks as if pleased at the predictability of human folly. I should have stopped the night the corridor learned how to anticipate my breath, but stopping is its own surrender, and I have never been good at handing myself over intact. The lamp swings once, precisely, as if someone had nodded. I hear the stone inhale near my ear, and a phrase that is half benediction and half binding. Manus tangit, nomen manet. A hand will touch, the name will remain. I pull away, because pulling away is the only movement left I fancy as refusal, but the phrase seeds itself in me like a parasite and grows hairline roots beneath my tongue. I leave level Z slower than I arrived, burdened not with books, but with a hearing that makes prayer and threat indistinguishable. Outside, the air tastes of traffic and bread and the living world's ordinary sins. Inside, the corridor folds itself shut like a mouth that has swallowed something it intends to digest forever. When I sleep, the frescoes chant me back in the dark, and I wake already answering in a language the walls taught before I knew what I was saying. The stair that led away from the index stacks smelled of ash and old wax, and drew me like a compass draws a needle to iron. The corridor was narrow, a throat between shelves, and at its end, a plastered arch had been opened where frescoes had once been trusted to seal history in gold. I followed the scent because habit is a kind of courage and curiosity is an occupation, because the key in my pocket felt heavier the more I pretended not to know why it warmed when I touched it. Inside, the chamber coffins stood on racks like files in a clerical archive, each one labelled with a slip of vellum tied with twine. Some names were legible, others were notations, abbreviations, sigla meant for insiders. The lids leaned against one another in a geometry of efficiency, not reverence. Where iron had been used, the nails still kept a dark sheen, and the wood around them wore circles like small moons. I walked the aisles with my lamp, counting the slips as if counting would make the dead proper items again, classifiable and harmless. A lid near the center trembled under my hand. At first the tremor was a shiver in the grain, and then it settled into pattern, an answering rhythm that sounded almost like breath. I put my gloved palm to the wood and felt warmth not passing into my skin, but acknowledging me, a presence that registered touch and did not recoil. It occurs to me now how intimate cataloguing can be. It asks you to name what it fears. The lid slid open, as if a hand inside had pushed, not violent but patient. The linen wrapped around whatever lay inside had the papery texture of dried riverweed, and rosary beads were sewn across the lips, as if binding prayer into silence. I leaned closer, because professionals are trained to approach anomalies like patients approach symptoms, clinically, without panic. The face beneath the cloth was not rotted in the way decomposition portraits in textbooks rot. Instead, it retained the false smoothness of a mask that had been worn too long. The eyes appeared hollowed and yet wet, as though a tide had receded and left them polished. I expected a smell like ruin. Instead, there was only the faint copper that reading had taught me to associate with pages and with old promises. When I say the corpse whispered my name, I do not mean it opened its mouth. I mean the chest made a small movement, an economy of breath that was more like refusal than life. The sound wavered into a consonant shaped from the room's timbre, and the syllable arrived worn with the texture of petitions. It is difficult to explain how a sound can be both a name and an accounting, a thing called and a debt tallied. In the pause after that smalling, an arithmetic accumulated in my head. All the bargains recorded in sealed packets, the confessions begging release from ledgers, the rosary knots tied to keep mouths from namming. I thought of the notes I had read, of priests who had written of bargains made in basements, and of saints who refused burial when their presence inconvenienced the city. The body shifted its mouth against the beads, and something like language congealed at the seam, not spoken but implied, an obligation moving through the ribs like a clerk passing a docket to a clerk. I reached without thinking, and a bead came free into my glove. It was warm and heavy and felt, for a second, like a pulse. I could have dropped it back and closed the lid and left the ledger of my life unamended. But curiosity is not a noble trait here. It is a ledger line you keep balancing until you owe everything. When I touched the bead with the tip of my tongue, it tasted of dust and prayer and old iron, and the chapel of my memory rearranged itself. Prayers I had learned as a child untied and retied into phrases that were not quite Latin. The coffin's lid closed itself with the precision of a verdict. When it did, the other lids shuddered, as if in applause or in relief, and the chamber contracted like a lung expelling a long breath. I kept the bead in my pocket because professionals are foolish and sentimental in private. On the stair, the smell of ash followed me up like a companion with etiquette. Back in my apartment, I set the bead under glass as one might set aside a specimen, and its warmth pierced the thin barrier of glass as if it had been impatient. Night taught me the difference between a token and a tether. The bead was both, and its pressure against the lining of my pocket translated into thoughts that were not wholly mine. I woke several times convinced that a dull pressure was pressing from beneath the bed like a hand taking inventory. Once, in the dawn between one sleep and another, I heard the faint click of beads rolling across floorboards, the same small metallic patter they had made when the coffin lid closed. I have tried to rationalize. Stray shell, thermal expansion, a pipe. Each rationalization is a paper bridge. They look secure until you walk them, and then you discover the current. The ledger in my head began to list obligations I had never been taught to measure. Names owed, vows unpaid, altars swapped for wood and given to a corridor in exchange for silence. I began to dream of processions I had not attended and of hands that carried wrapped forms through halls that did not exist by day. In those dreams, the wrapped forms sometimes reached up and tapped the shoulders of the bearers, as if reminding them that bargains had terms and the terms included memory. I woke each morning with the taste of rosary beads in the back of my throat and an urge to count the steps from my bed to the window. When I returned to level Z, the chamber had been rearranged, as if by a clerk with a different habit. A lid that had been nailed down showed a split in the wood where someone, or something, had pried. A slip of vellum that had been neatly tied was now frayed. The archivists upstairs pretended not to notice. Their indifference may be professional, or it may be fear polite as a glove. I filed an incident report in the ledger provided for that bureaucratic cruelty and wrote as if the words could hold the thing back. Location, time, temperature, humidity, condition of lids, anomalies observed. The report is a kind of prayer I do not believe in. It is a list and lists of weight. Later, when I unfolded the paper to double-check the penmanship, a line I had not written glowed faintly on the margin in a hand that matched my illegible scrawl. It read, "We keep inventory because inventory lets us pretend the living and the ledger are separate." When I folded the report back into its envelope, the bead in my pocket warmed still. I tell myself the bead is a talisman I can offer up, but when I close my fist, it whispers the inventory back into my palm and lists me last, as if I had been filed like every other thing the church keeps in its quiet rooms. I am careful to ascend the stairs with the same rhythm I have practiced since the first inspection. 1-2, pause, 1-2, as if cadence can buy me time between worlds. The key in my pocket is a weight that measures shame. Its metal edge warms against the fabric as if remembering the smear of a page. At the vestibule, the air changes the way a tide changes temperature, not by degrees, but by profession. Officials who have never seen level Z become polished and useful, their indifference a varnish that keeps questions from sticking. I pass clerks whose eyes slide to my badge and return to their ledgers with the polite rigor of people who have been taught to unsee. The familiarity of their trained blindness should comfort me. Instead, it feels like collusion. I should have stopped when the receptionist's smile had the exact circumference of a sealed envelope. But I have long since learned that the only way out of a library is through its doors. He is waiting in the anteroom like an accusation that has been pressed into the shape of a man. I recognize him from the clearance papers, not his face, but the slant of his signature, a flourish I have matched to ink and seal. He wears cardinal red, though muted, like a memory of blood, the sash tied exactly so, and the mosetta sitting on his shoulders like a coin I can never spend. When he steps forward, the room inhales, and the priest beside the door crosses himself as if to brace art for gravity. He bows, the motion practiced, then straightens with an economy of ritual. Up close his skin is the color of old vellum, and his eyes are small and fast. They do not register surprise, because surprise is impolite in men who keep lists. He takes my hand in both of his hands and says my name, not as a question but as a ledger entry, and then adds with gentle amusement that he remembers nothing about signing my clearance. He smiles. It is a smile with rules. I'm already listing explanations in my head. Lapses of memory, bureaucratic failings, an assistant who forged the ink. None of them feel adequate. I should have stopped the conversation when his rosary made a small, involuntary movement against his fingers, but I stay out of a perverse respect for the choreography of confession. He does not meet my eyes. He speaks in a tone reserved for absolution or for sending debts out to sea. There is the same softness in both. "You must leave," he says, and the phrase is a benediction that smells like a summons. He refuses to look at the key in my hand, though he signed it into being with an eagle's stroke not 48 hours earlier. He says the archives are misfiled, that there are corridors that should not be crossed more than once, that certain ledgers require cold storage away from ordinary curiosity. He offers me the sort of advice that carries the force of a command, because a cardinal is a man who can arrange that rooms forget. I listen, and I think of the packets I have unwrapped, the confessions that ask not for exorcism, but for release from account books, the saint who would not be buried because his presence complicated property lines. His words are all soothed edges. They shape the same suggestion. Go away and do not be seen to have gone down. I should have left when the first syllable escaped him, but I am invested in the truth in the way a debtor is invested in the books a bank refuses to close. He repeats his instruction with a different cadence. Leave before nightfall. There is a name in that postponement, an implied calendar with a deadline that smells of ritual. He stands, too, and the small hairs on his hands bristle under the beads of his rosary as if they, too, swear allegiance. I notice for the first time that the rosary is not strung in the order I know. Decades are misaligned, the crucifix worn inward, the beads nearer to each other as if someone had pushed them together to keep a secret. When I point this out politely, as if pointing at a misfiled book, he chuckles with a sound like paper being crushed. We all keep peculiar things for the purposes of propriety, he says. The laugh should have been a return to humanity. Instead, it clarifies him into the wrong kind of man. One who can wear anonymity like armor, who can sign your name, and then deny having known you. I begin to understand there are roles here that are more useful if played badly. The official who refuses memory, the steward who refuses to see what the ledger lists. I ask him why he asks me to leave, and he folds his hands as if closing a map. He tells a story about a basilica on the edge of town, whose bells once tolled only on the day of a saint's death, and then fell silent because the saint required silence as a housekeeping task. He tells it as an anecdote, but the telling curves back on itself and becomes instruction. Some presences are tolerated only if they remain legend and not lived. He inclines his head and tells me, not as a warning but as a condolence, that some things follow what reads them. That line catches in my throat because it names the mechanism I had only felt. Reading is not neutral here. It is the currency that draws appetite. I should have left once he had spoken that sentence, because knowledge then became a liability, but I am a poor accountant of my own safety. At the edge of the anteroom, he pauses and blesses me in a way that feels almost like theft. The sign he makes is deliberate, and the thumb traces a place on my forehead where a mark could be made without breaking skin. The gesture is small, ecclesiastical. It is also knotted with an insinuation I do not want to dissect. As he steps back, the light in the corridor flickers and steadies in a ratio that feels like a breath count. I sense the presence of someone else in the room without seeing them, a patient shadow at the corner as attentive as moss to damp. The cardinal smiles again, and this time I hear velvet. He says he hopes I will forget what I cannot understand, and that forgetting is a mercy the church grants when a ledger would otherwise overflow. His voice cools like wine left too long. He tells me to come to no harm and then, as if reminding himself that bargains have receipts, asks whether I have been given anything I should not possess. I hand him the stray bead from the coffin chamber without thinking, because gesture is easier than explanation, and because we have been taught to offer tokens in the place of stories. He takes it, and his fingers close, with a familiarity that suggests he has handled such things before. He slides the bead into his palm and hides it behind the rosary, as if tucking a confession into a sleeve. He says lightly that I must go. He promises to forget, that I have been here if I walk away without returning to level Z. The word sits between us like a banknote. He does not say what will happen if I do not go. He does not need to. He merely folds the map of conversation closed and gestures the way ushers gesture at those they will never again seat. The ritual is efficient, a blessing, a request, a denial of memory. I stand there, a clerk who realizes his ledger is insufficient to catalogue what he has seen. I sign an imaginary receipt in the air and turn toward the door. Outside, the city smells of diesel and orange peels, of vendors setting up and of morning traffic that believes itself honest. The cardinal watches me cross the piazza and his shadow lags like a question mark. I walk away thinking to myself that perhaps this is enough, that walking will unstick the ledger that now marks me. But on the tram, I count my breaths and notice my mouth tastes of varnish, as though the rosary knot had been unwound against my tongue. I should have left Rome entirely. I do not. That night the cardinal's name appears in my ledger, not in his handwriting, but in mine, a repetition that feels like guilt. I do not remember writing it. The entry reads only, "He did not know me." The ink is fresh and certain. When I fold the page back, my hand smells faintly of incense and old wax. The bead remains in my pocket, warm and patient. I know, with a sort of clerk stubbornness, that forgetfulness here is a service and a sentence. I also know that someone with the power to deny ink has the power to withhold mercy. I sleep poorly and dream of a room full of men who have signed their own names, and then learn to pretend those signatures were forgeries. I wake to the sound of a knock at the door that is not 3 and not 4, but exactly between. When I answer, there is no one there, only a scrap of red twine and a slip of vellum that reads in handwriting I do not recognize. We forgive what we can't keep. I should have left when the cardinal asked me to, but forgiveness is a currency here, and I am hopelessly insolvent. I tell myself I am leaving level Z for the final time with professional detachment, as if packing a fragile folio and tucking it into a satchel could be the same as filing a report and closing a drawer. It is not. The satchel is heavier than the ledger claims. It sits against my hip like a heartbeat that will not consent to be catalogued under personal effects. I pass the same clerks on the stair whose eyes move past me like shutters catching light. Their indifference is a ritual, and I am its sacrament. I tell no one on the tram, I declare no purpose at the barrier, and the city takes me back with the generous anonymity of those who have never been marked by a ledger. My apartment greets me with ordinary things arranged in ordinary angles. Kettle, chipped mug, 2 chairs, bookshelf, a window that mouths traffic. I place the satchel on my table as if setting down evidence, and because I cannot help the hunger for containment, I begin the process of destruction as if it were conservation. I pull out the manuscript and lay it beside the ashtray like a specimen before an autopsy. I strike a match with fingers that remember the feel of parchment. Flame teeth the edge of the first leaf, and then the next. The paper curls, blackens, and for a moment I feel clean. Smoke drifts like a confession up into the lamplight and then out the window. I imagine, absurdly, that ash will be enough, that fire will remember the ledger's commandments and not return what it is asked to forget. Ash settles where pages were. I flatten my palm over the remains and feel nothing but the heat of the match long gone. I place the ash into a municipal bin and step back, as if distance can make a thing not return. That night, I dream of the coffer in level Z, of lids opening politely to admit me as if I were late to a meeting. I wake with the taste of rosary beads at the back of my throat and the sensation of breath at my collar, as though someone had leaned close to check a margin. The apartment is unchanged, or so it claims. I make coffee. I answer an email. I convince myself the dangerous part is behind me, that consolation is brittle. When I unzip the satchel the next morning, a narrow strip of vellum is slipped between the linings, not burned, not blackened, only folded with precise care, as if someone had expected my pyrotechnics and prepared a spare. I unfold it. The ink is wet enough to smear, but dries before I can make a stain. Symbols I thought I had memorized at level Z slide into new alignments, and worst of all, into my handwriting. A notation I do not remember making appears in a margin I know I did not write. The script says, simply and in the passive voice the archives prefer, transitus successit, transit has occurred. When I laugh, because laughter is the only antidote my training gives me, the sound breaks in the apartment like glass, and something in the bookshelf coughs as though offended. I tell myself to leave the city, to hand everything to an authority that pretends it knows how to manage such anomalies. I do not. I call an acquaintance to ask about storage facilities, and the voice on the line pauses as if the telephone itself has listened and is reconsidering business hours. That evening a smear appears on my bathroom mirror. It is not placed by a hand. It unfurls from the glass in a way that looks like wet ink trying to remember a calligraphy stroke. A line curls, pauses, and then unspools into a symbol the manuscript favored. I place a towel over it like a liturgical covering, and then peel the towel away with trembling curiosity. The symbol is damp and glossy, and when it dries a faint residue remains, a fingerprint of ink that resists sponges and window cleaner. I try bleach, I try vinegar, and the marks retreat only to deepen again between attempts, as if the glass practices a stubbornness more intimate than any bureaucrat's. I wipe the mirror until the skin on my palms is raw and my hands ring with the memory of pages burned and then replaced. I sleep poorly and dream of hands, folding the same sheet of paper into the same origami form and slipping it beneath the lining of my suitcase like a coin hidden under a tongue. At night the mattress presses as if someone were reading beside me. The weight is not violent. It is precise and patient, localized like the palm of an old friend resting on a shoulder. I do not see a shape. I feel a presence cataloguing my ribs. Sometimes the pressure moves to my side, and in that movement my breath learns a phrase I do not want to know. Pages turn in the apartment when every bookcase declares emptiness. I hear the soft papery shush, as if somebody is leafing pages to test whether the story is still present in the fibers. Any attempt to leave the room is met with a reluctance so corporeal I imagine the floors themselves are reluctant to be crossed. Once, I wake to the sound of a single page being turned, and the lamp beside my bed illuminating a line of text in a book I have not opened for years. The words are the same blasphemous margin notes that have spread like a ledger across my life. I think of the cardinal's smile and the rosary hidden in his hand, and anger scenes itself in me like a draught. I cannot throw the mattress into the courtyard. I cannot file the air. My attempts at rational solutions reveal themselves as patchwork. Mattress protector, motion sensor, the mechanical click of a metronome to falsify the rhythm. The metronome ticks and the pressure waits its measure and then shifts as if amused by my instruments. The manuscript does not remain mute. Fragments appear in the most practical places. A folded scrap in the pocket of the jacket I wore the day I left Level Z. A margined note tucked into the spine of a library book I had never borrowed. Sometimes the fragments are blank until I look at them. Presence writes them like a hand moving a pen that does not belong to me. I try to trap the thing by photographing the page and sending the image to myself in an email. The attachment arrives with an extra file that opens into a sound clip, the faint rustle of paper, a syllable like a cough, then silence. I play the clip and my teeth feel lined with frost. I forward it to a colleague in the hope that witnesses make things less monstrous. He replies with a single sentence, "Do not reply to this thread." The warning arrives like a stamp. I attempt the only ceremony I know that promises finality. I burn what remains of the manuscript in the sink, water and flame together, a small domestic ritual. The pages curl and blacken, and then the water takes the ash with a sound like someone shushing the world. The drain gulps. I breathe out, and the apartment is quiet for a span that tastes like reprieve. The next morning the drain is full of beads, rosary-like spheres, as if the manuscript had paid its toll in the language of prayer. They spill when I pull the plug and scatter across the linoleum with a sound that maps the geometry of a ledger closing. One bead rests against the baseboard and looks up at me like an accusation. I pick it up, and it is warm as a coin just spent. People are practical until the ledger touches them. I tell myself, absurdly, that the manuscript follows because it is a function of proximity. Paper seeks paper, ink seeks ink. That is not why. It follows because the act of reading is an invitation. The thing in Level Z recognized the reader and decided the reader might serve as a bridge. I wake with the sensation that the book has learned the contours of my life. My corner table, my chipped mug, my habit of tapping 2 times before I walk through a doorway. It makes choices to be near me in those rhythms, settling in corners I cannot reach without thought. It writes my routines like marginalia and then folds those notes into the lining of my days. I try to resist, to make myself unpredictable. I change my route to work. I buy different coffee. The manuscript adjusts within hours, leaving crumbs where I once reached for the handle, arranging its presence so that I will notice but not understand the method. At the window one morning, I find a line of script traced beneath the condensation, as if a breath from the street has written me a note. It reads, "Non relinquimus. We do not relinquish." The phrase sits there glistening like a verdict. My hand shakes when I trace it with a finger, and my skin pricks as if the letters have teeth. The manuscript has crossed the boundary I thought would contain it. It has not merely followed my body, but insinuated itself into the grammar of my days. It will not be satisfied by distance or by fire. I place my palm against the glass and feel the faint throb of paper beating through the wall. I press my forehead to the pane and think of the ledger in Level Z, the hands that signed, the cardinal who pretended not to know me, and I understand it cleanly and with the small clarity of a ledger entry. The archive never gives back what it lends. When I try to fold the satchel and hide it deep under clothes, the manuscript slips out on its own and lies on the pillow like a patient thing that knows where I sleep. They arrive with the small patience of people who have practiced being in the wrong place for the right reasons. I first notice a shadow in the street below my window at dusk. Not a casual silhouette, but a figure in black, whose cassock hangs with the deliberate stiffness of a garment that has been starched for ceremony rather than warmth. He stands by the bakery, an oddly secular sentinel, hands folded, head inclined, as if listening to a distant confession. When I look closer, I realize his collar is wrong. It is stitched backward so the white of it faces the spine, not the throat, and his rosary has been blackened until the beads resemble small pitted stones. Habit tells me this is symbolic. Habit has failed me infrequently enough that when it errs I pay attention. The first night I tell myself I am being paranoid. The second night there are two. By the third night, a man leans on the lamppost across from my building, and his shadow touches the stair I use without moving his feet. They are not hidden. They are visible in the open, and that is what makes them worse. Cataloguers who do not bother with secrecy because secrecy would presume fear. They do not come up the stairs. They do not approach the door. Instead, they gather under the streetlight as if forming a choir that does not sing. Their collars glint like the inside of a ledger. I begin counting, one at the corner, one by the post box, one packing the square. Counting is a trick to keep panic in the shape of numbers. It fails when the rosaries begin to click in unison like a metronome set to a rhythm I did not teach them. I watch from the window with the helpless curiosity of a man who has been catalogued already, as if observation could be armor. Their faces are ordinary enough to be unremarkable, except for the way their mouths do not crease when they smile, and for the way their eyes catch light and refuse reflection. Once, when a breeze lifts the hem of a cassock, I see the inside embroidered with ledger marks, tiny stitches that read like inventory codes. I imagine clerks who have been paid in silence for years, paid now in something blacker, and I tell myself I will not be catalogued as well. I should have left Rome when they first made themselves noticed. The first note arrives on a Tuesday. It is a small slip of vellum, folded like a ration, pushed under the door with enough force to catch the threshold and then stop politely. I find it because my foot closes against it when I walk in. The handwriting is not the cardinal's. It is a paler, more officious script. The message is brief and precise. Return what you read or we return you. No signature, no flourish. It lands on my kitchen table like a receipt and smells faintly of old incense. The verbs are threats without verbs, passive constructions as promises. I hold it between two fingers and feel the parchment warm as if someone else had just let go. My first reaction is logistic. Where is what I read? Which shelf swallowed the manuscript when I thought I had thrown it to flame? I rehearse excuses in my head. Misplaced, misfiled, destroyed. Then a bead I had taken from a coffin presses against my palm like an accusation, and the note stiffens into a contract I did not consent to sign. They do not send messages again. They prefer presence. The men in cassocks take positions that map too neatly onto my life. The corner by the bakery observes the tram I take. The lamppost man times the streetlights I pass. The pitted bead rosary that clicks like a watch sits on a bench outside my building and matches the cadence of my steps. At odd hours, I catch myself halting mid-step because the street smells of wax and old paper, and I realize they have moved closer without me hearing them. Once I exit my building early to break the pattern, walking to the plaza via a route I have never used, they are already there, folding themselves around benches like punctuation. I understand that their work is not to arrest me physically, but to teach me a new modesty, to make me compact my life into the smallest possible shape so the ledger's appetite will pass. I try to bargain with that logic. Stay small, disappear inward, do not read aloud. The bargain feels stupid and childish, even as I shape it into prayer, because the transaction that formed level Z was made in coins older than commerce. I put up blinds and blackout curtains, thinking of secrecy as a dome under which things can forget me. Curtain fabric does not stop sound. It only softens edges. At night, I hear footfalls along the pavement that I never heard before. I imagine they are for me, and then realize I have become interchangeable with a book or a ledger entry. Once, when I walk the dog of a neighbor who out of charity or curiosity lets me borrow him, the animal refuses to cross the square where the men gather. He whines and lifts his paws as if the stones themselves have teeth. I'm acutely aware of the rosaries clicking in the distance, arranging themselves to a tempo devised for patience, not panic. Every sound I make becomes an offering. When I cough, I feel documented. They are not all men. A woman in a plain, backward-stitched collar sits under the arcade of a church with her hands in her lap like a statue come alive and watches the door of my building with the kind of attention once reserved for relics. Her hair is cropped close. Her fingers show ink stains as though she had been writing ledgers with her palms. She is the most human of them only in the small and terrible way that makes her worse. She blinks. It is the single obscene motion in the composition of their stillness, because a blink is the smallest concession to softness, and therefore the smallest abuse of mercy. When she hands me a second note, this one slid under the stairwell door when I returned from the tram. The message is a single Latin phrase scrawled in the margin: restituas, restore. It reads like a plea from someone who has forgotten they are a sentinel. I attempt logic. I go to the archivists, to the clerk who once looked away when I asked about level Z. He palms his ledger and closes it like a book upon my fingers. The motion is practiced and final. He tells me about duties and about chain of custody and about protocols. He measures me with the same eyes I have measured pages with and finds me wanting. I demand of him, who watches citizens who open ledgers. He replies with a bureaucratic kindness. There are custodians for every class of anomaly, sir. The word custodian has meaning there beyond its ordinary clerical use. It suggests a person whose trade is memory management. I ask him if custodians follow outside the library. He says that is rarely necessary, and his tone says it would be shockingly inconvenient to reveal how often it is necessary. He suggests counseling. I should have accepted help then, or at least the fiction of it. Instead, I walk out feeling observed by his closed ledger, as much as by the men in rosaries. One night I set the manuscript's remaining scrap, only a single folded flake of vellum, on the windowsill and watch to see whether the watchers will take it as tribute. They do not come for the scrap. Instead, the woman with the inked palms appears across from me and raises her hand with the slow politeness of someone operating in a room where gestures are counted. She mouths the single word I have been hearing in my head for weeks: restituas, and for a second it is just sound, and not a sentence. I open the window to speak, and the cold that comes in carries the smell of level Z, old glue, ash, and the human heat of pages unread. She slides a small envelope along the stone sill. Inside is a single bead like the ones I have been gathering, and a note that reads, "We are not all merciless. Return it, and the ledger will balance. Keep it, and the ledger will keep you." The sentence is legalistic and personal at once. It expects me to be the sort of rational actor who will calculate probabilities and choose the least painful option. I am not that sort of thing. I am a man who has catalogued his own curiosity into a debt, and now the collectors are polite. When I wake from those nights, I find the apartment rearranged in small, deliberate ways. A chair moved so its back faces the door, a Bible I never owned open to a verse I cannot tolerate, a string tied to the leg of the table that leads in the dark to the satchel where I have hidden fragments. I cut the string. The string ties itself again. I burn the bead and wake with it under my pillow like a warm stone. I call the cardinal out of anger, out of hope. The line clicks, and the voice that answers is not the voice I remember. It is layered, as if two men speak through one throat, and the greeting is kindly and distant. He says he cannot conceptualize myself as frightened. He offers the same thin absolution he offered before. His last words before the line dies are not comfort, but an observation. Objects have owners and owners have ledgers. Choose which you wish to be. When the call ends, the rosaries click outside like metronomes set to the heartbeat of Rome itself. I try to leave the city. The ticket window looks like the ledger's face, polite, unhelpful. My suitcase is lighter for a moment, and then heavier as a bead shifts in a hidden seam. The men in cassocks are at the station in ways that defy timetables, waiting by the barrier, seated on benches as if entitled to the timetable. They stand as I approach, and the ticket agent looks at me with a sympathetic inefficiency. "Travel documents," he says, as if the phrase will close the conversation. I step away and do not board. I should have left when the first man stood at the bakery, when the cardinal smiled and claimed not to know me, when the bead warmed my pocket in the coffin chamber. I did not. They tell me, in thin sentences and in postures that make walking feel like a crime, to return what I read. They tell me, through slips of vellum and through the city's architecture, that the archive remembers debts more patiently than humans. I hold the bead against my ribs and feel the ledger count me again. The envelope under the sill promised balance if I returned what I stole. I do not know whether I fear the ledger's repayment more than I fear what the ledger keeps when it is satisfied. I wake with a thumb pressed into the soft of my throat, as if someone has marked the place where confession begins. The room smells of old wax and coffee gone bitter. For a half hour before morning, I speak without memory, phrases that sound like prayer and ledger entries at once. Me culpa nomen manit, pactum servata. The syllables are precise, not my invention, and when I try to stop them, my jaw works like a bell whose clapper cannot be restrained. I tell myself this is sleepwalking neurological error. I tell myself a ledger cannot rewrite the muscles of my mouth. The mattress gives no counsel. The syllables keep tally. "Return what you read," the ledger said. I tried it and found it a lie. The manuscript is no longer an object. It is a syntax that has learned my throat. At night, the prayer begins as breath and ends as claim. The name leaves me and the room replies, altering small things to fit its account. A kettle that boils late, a colleague who forgets a meeting, a ledger entry appearing in someone else's file. The world corrects itself to fit the account the manuscript keeps. My skin writes itself with a hand I do not own. Lines rise beneath the surface like pale script. I press them and the ridges answer with words. Nomen, claves, servitium. I scratch until my nails bleed and the blood maps punctuation into the grooves. Once the ridges rearranged into a single sentence, nos servamus. We keep. The letters do not bruise like ordinary marks. They read like marginalia beneath flesh, indifferent to pain. I keep records of these occurrences in an old accounting notebook, the sort of book archivists use to excuse superstition with numbers. Each entry feels performative, as if logging is both ward and offering. At 3:17 precisely, my mouth starts. The name leaves me and the room replies, sometimes softly, sometimes with a chorus that counts bone. I mark days by the tenor of the answer. Soft replies bring small reprieves, lost buses that arrive, a phone that rings when it should, while hard replies arrange misfortunes that compound and point back at me. Isolation seemed a defense. New apartments, different routes, strangers' apartments. The watchers moved their posts, but not their intent. The cassock men are patient. Single columns are easier to total. So I pretend normality, coffee, cinema, volunteering, and each action becomes a line the manuscript annotates. Invitations misdate. Friends forget. Emails arrive with marginal notes written in a hand that mimics mine. Everything becomes a record the ledger can append to its balance sheet. Once a flake of vellum appeared on my desk, as if coughed up by the day, colleagues turn away or offer tired remedies. Rest only lets the name rethread itself. I have shown fragments. People look and find either nothing or a warning they prefer not to voice. I emailed an image to a friend once. He replied in a way that read like a clerk's seal. Do not reply to this thread. The net stamped the message and closed the loop. Whenever I try to externalize, the ledger contracts and the world adjusts to reabsorb what I expose. The recommended cures, rest, therapy, leave, are humane and deadly because they place me where I can be catalogued and monitored. The ledger prefers predictability because predictability makes balancing easier. Manuscript prefers company. It wants other ledgers to read against. I tried to sequester, but the watchers shifted. Isolation simplifies the accounting and makes totals quicker to settle. So I drag myself into public, a film where strangers hide the projection's light, coffee with a neighbor, an art opening. Each attempt returns with amendments, names rearranged on guest lists, volunteers who forget appointments, frames repeating on a screen that look like marginalia. Even kindness is scored. The manuscript is bureaucratic and intimate. It changes documents on a small scale, marginal notes, dates shifted, appointments altered, and they appear in hands that look almost like mine. Emails arrive from my address asking for clarifications I cannot provide. One line replies read, adversus silentium, against the silence. The message is not menace so much as insistence. The ledger will be heard. I try to resist by uttering other things, my mother's name, recipes, meaningless nursery rhymes, but the prayer threads itself between syllables. Once I spoke my mother's name, and the ritual began in the middle of it. The neighbor across the hall knocked the next morning and said he had dreamt of pages turning. Dreams, too, have become the ledger's province. I keep a ledger of my ledger. Entries I do not remember writing appear in my own hand. I wake with impressions of signatures on my fingers as if I had closed a book in my sleep. Attempted refusal becomes an entry, resistivit, additus. Resisted, then added. The manuscript is patient. It waits for a hand to tire. I have tried arithmetic, overpay the tally, flood it with signatures, but accounts do not accept remorse as currency. The ledger trades in names and recitations. It needs spoken anchors. Perhaps that is why the manuscript taught me prayer. Prayers are contracts written with breath. Perhaps it never intended to let the object go. Perhaps it wanted a mortal mouth to make its entries binding. I have become both hand that signs and clerk that files. The ledger keeps its account by hollowing memory. To forget is to be more easily balanced. Tonight I sit with my accounting lamp and write these words because writing is a witness, even if the witness will be folded into the ledger's own margins. I press the pen into the page until the nib catches and the ink pools like a small wound. I fold the page, place it beneath the bead I cannot surrender, and wait. The apartment inhales. The lamp tilts in the same small motion the wick in level Z used to tilt when something chose to lean closer. I feel the old fulcrum in my jaw and know, with a clerk's resignation, that when the name comes from me tonight the world will answer in figures. At 3:17 my mouth forms the prayer and something answers from inside my ribs. In that answer I hear the ledger close and realize I have become its signature.